Welcome. Thank you for those words, Mr. Secretary, Your Eminences, Your Excellency, Reverend Clergy, Brother Archons, Dr. Martinos and Dr. Limbarakis and Mr. Martinos, fellow Archons, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real honor to welcome Secretary Pompeo. Thank you for making the quite long trip here. I think the tally was 20 hours or so through thunderstorms and other disruptions, we'll say. In your speech, you mentioned a little bit of your personal ties to the Orthodox community. I was wondering, especially us being blessed to have your wife Susan here, if you could expand on that a little bit and tell us a little bit more.
You know, it's always been something that's been a very important part of our life. Our hometown, we've spent a lot of time at the church in Wichita, Kansas. We've been to Pascha there, no short thing of its own. And we love the people. There's a huge Orthodox community in Wichita. Some of the most decent, lovely, wonderful people. And of course, the fact that my wife and son are part of the church always made sure that it was a central part of who we were. I attended, and Susan and I taught Sunday school at a Presbyterian church there, but the Orthodox church was always and remains part of our life and close to our heart.
Very good. You made religious freedom a real cornerstone of your tenure as Secretary of State. And in that time, a lot of progress was made. And in the years since, the world changes, obviously. And I think we see some different trends emerging. Of those trends, which do you find the most alarming?
Oh, goodness. I guess as a uniquely American matter, I watched religious freedom shunned from the global diplomatic stage by the United States State Department, replaced by climate change and DEI. I don't mean this politically, it's just their focus. It's no great secret. And it's not political in the sense of those are choices they make, but from my perspective, that creates real risk in the world. If America isn't out working hard to build religious freedom, you will see it begin to decay. You'll begin to see it decay in Africa. You'll begin to see it decay in the Middle East, where we worked incredibly hard in and around Mosul and the like to help Christians being persecuted in Iraq. You'll just see the decay begin. It is important that America provide the leadership and the backstop for articulating the reason that religious freedom matters to nations, for prosperity and peace, and why it matters to individuals, a basic matter of human dignity and fundamental rights. And so that's the American piece. I've also watched the Chinese Communist Party make further progress in places like Africa and elsewhere. And wherever the Chinese Communist Party goes, it is a Marxist, atheist at best, antagonistic to religion leadership that wants to take those rights away because it knows that religious freedom presents real risks to their authoritarian regime. And so I would say those are the two places. I worry about America not leading, and I worry about the Chinese Communist Party's faithlessness making progress on the world stage.
You mentioned Africa. By 2050, Africa will have a population of 2.4 billion, up from 1.4 billion today. They'll be at 4.2 billion within 100 years. They have an incredibly young population, which is going to spark huge economic growth. They have incredible resources. And so they may be really the most critical region in the world. China, as you say, recognizes this. They've infiltrated every level of society in many African countries. And meanwhile, Russia's Wagner Group and the Russian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate are becoming more and more assertive across the continent, most recently in Niger. And at the same time, Africa is a continent with incredibly strong faith communities, but they're in conflict. We remember the martyrs killed by ISIS that had been canonized by the church. And today, and in recent years, 90% of the Christians who are killed for their faith are killed in Nigeria. So the question I am working towards is, how do you think countries, the US and otherwise, should respond to what's happening in Nigeria and across the continent?
It's an important question. The Trump administration didn't do enough in Nigeria either. We worked it. We recognized these weren't just farmers going at each other. We understood this was religious-based. This was Christian persecution, bar none. So we got the perspective right, and we got the policy better, but we didn't get it done enough. I remember the first time, I almost said governor, Ambassador Brownback came in to brief me on the progress we were making, and we knew we didn't have enough leverage to get it right with the government there. So we began to build out a strategy. It is an absolute imperative that we help not only the Christians in Nigeria, but Christians that are throughout Africa, including sometimes we forget North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, and the like as well, that it is under threat from their governments and from the Chinese Communist Party that is also actively working to undermine churches in the region as well. There are solutions to this. There are resources that can be provided, government resources. There are tools that can be used that are what I'll call intergovernmental NGO resources that can be used to provide support for the people who need it. But I must say, when it comes to the churches in these regions, the most important thing that we can do is make sure that the churches themselves have the space and the room that they need. And there are U.S. government policies that they can't fix it, but they can make it better and give them the encouragement and the heart. And I know many of you have worked in this region. Bless you for that. This is important work. It is the fastest growing part of the world, both for just the total number of people and for religious believers. And I hope that we make sure that as the population grows, so do the faithful.
With that serious note, perhaps I'll give us something to give us heart as we move forward. And it's actually a story that our ACLJ colleague, Dr. Economou, told me earlier this week. And that is those 21 martyrs who were killed by ISIS, all but one were Coptic Christians. The last was from sub-Saharan Africa. And when asked by his killers who he was, he said, "I'm with them." And then he went, obviously, to his death, as we all know. Incredible faith by him, and a real example, I think, of how we need to approach this issue of religious freedom. Tomorrow is the first global summit of Archons. We have 292 Archons from 22 countries meeting here in Athens to discuss our global mission to defend the ecumenical patriarchate and all the world's faithful. It's really the first meeting of its kind in history, and we have leading voices from business, from science, from academia, from the public sector. Do you have a call to action for this group as they prepare for their meeting tomorrow and as they conduct their business?
Of course. I think the most important thing you can do as you get this opportunity to fellowship with people that you don't get a chance to see every day and be with is encourage each other to be fearless. The pressure to hide your candle under a bushel, as the good book speaks to, the pressure to round the corners or take a shortcut or not speak directly about the most essential piece of human nature, each of our capacity to practice our faith and our core beliefs. The pressure is real. There are those who want to undermine exactly the gathering that you are holding tomorrow. Don't let them win. Be absolutely fierce. Victory is his if you all get it right. Make sure that focus comes from the right place, from your heart, and that you encourage others to do the same. If you get those things right, this would be my simple call to action. I talked about the fact that Susan and I taught 5th grade Sunday school. 25 5th graders a year for a handful of years. I don't know. Perhaps we touched 150 lives or 200 lives. But we were always mindful when we would go to Wichita State basketball games some years later, and somebody who I couldn't imagine was already in college, because it meant how old I was, would come up to us and say, you were my 5th grade Sunday school teacher. That young person doesn't know Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State or CIA Director. That young person knew that Susan and Mike had decided to come to church and to be with them for an hour and to teach them simple Bible verses and simple Bible lessons. Never underestimate the scale of the simple acts that each of us can take every day. We're counting on policymakers. I hope we get good prime ministers and good presidents and good monarchs. I hope we get fine people, good people doing those things. I am counting on you. I'm counting on you to get it right and to be with others and encourage others to get it right, because in the end, the things that make for religious freedom are built on basic blocks, and you are part of that. I am so thrilled that I got this chance to be here to share with you that central idea that if we wait for someone in Washington or London or Athens to get it right, no, look to yourselves, look to your home, look to your families, and look to your faith. Look to Constantinople. And if we get those right, then good things will happen. Thank you.
As you've mentioned, the ecumenical patriarchate suffers from a severe religious freedom deficit. There are 5 major issues, namely lack of legal personality, government interference in elections, the forcible closure of Halki Seminary, the confiscation of thousands of properties, and the non-recognition of ecumenical status. We view these issues as archons, and we have hope for the future, that one day our efforts will be met with success in each of those areas. And from time to time, we do see progress. And at other times, we see steps backwards, like the conversion of Hora Monastery, like you mentioned in your speech. You know and have a relationship with President Erdogan and the other leaders of Turkey. And understanding that they are also a key NATO ally, what is your approach to dealing with these 5 issues and with the situation with Hora and with Hagia Sophia?
Well, I mentioned Hora. I pray that Halki, I'm glad that you have it on the top of your list. It's incredibly important. So it's a challenge, and President Erdogan is a challenge for sure. And so I always worked to make that relationship better, stronger, not always successfully. When I traveled to Turkey and didn't manage to find time to meet with President Erdogan, it was noted. Perhaps a message that the responsibility of governments is to allow faith leaders to practice their faith, and that President Erdogan needs to do that as well. But if you ask as a policy matter, my policy matter is that the people of Turkey will one day elect leadership, whether that's President Erdogan with a different view or a different leader, that the people of Turkey will elect a broad set of leaders, both mayors in Ankara and mayors in Istanbul and all around the country. I hope they'll elect leaders who share that vision, not my Christian vision necessarily, but a vision for religious freedom and tolerance. And that is an enormous challenge for that place today. As a security matter, it's an enormous challenge that they're a NATO member and haven't always managed to find their way to working on behalf of the things that at least the United States believes are NATO's best interest. We used carrots, we used whatever sticks that we might have, trying to encourage them and remind them of these responsibilities that they had as a NATO member, and right inside of NATO's charter, the freedom and sovereignty of every nation as well. So, maybe that's enough said. I'm deeply aware of the challenge. The list that you put together there makes perfect sense as good projects for the Archons that are assembling tomorrow.
Some have called what's going on with Hora cultural memoricide. Do you think this is a fair term?
Yes, I think they're undoubtedly trying to wash away history, wash away memories. We see this in lots of places. We see people who try to wash away the Holocaust. We see people who washed away Christian historical sites in the Middle East during conflict. We've seen the Russians going after Ukrainian holy sites as well. And so this is not a new effort to undermine faith with the destruction of religious history and religious places. It's a bit of a side story, but I had this chance to film a movie now about 2 years ago. It's called Route 60. Along with Ambassador Friedman, we walked the trail of Judea and Samaria, Jewish sites, Christian sites, and we ended up in Hebron, where Abraham and Sarah were buried. These places matter. The reason we went there was to tell the story of these places, to create memories. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about the conflicts of the moment. It was about the fact that when you walk those roads, when you walk those places, it is impossible not to grab the good book and see that history was in those places. And when you try to wipe these away, call it memoricide, call it the destruction of educating the next generation and the things that have come before them, the important faith institutions that built upon the faith institutions of today. This is truly dangerous, it is intentional, and we should all do our best to ensure that those sites are not eliminated and they are preserved for generations that come behind us as well.
Thank you. I've got a couple more questions, but soon we're going to turn to the audience. Staff have note cards, and if you have a question, please write it down and pass it back. Please include your name, where you're from, whether you're an Archon or not, and your organization if you could. And I'll review them and ask the Secretary a few more questions. You mentioned China a few times, and I want to turn there and really focus. In my view, at least, they are the greatest threat to Western civilization, to human rights, and to religious freedom. We see a modern-day Holocaust, millions of Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, evangelical pastors thrown in prison for years for no other reason than that they've lived their faith. I'm proud to say that when I was actually at the Commerce Department, we were the first U.S. government agency to put any consequences in place for their behavior in Xinjiang. Does the issue of religious freedom fit into this China challenge? And if it does, what role does it play?
Oh, it of course does. There are many challenges from the Chinese Communist Party, and you should note that's a little awkward, Chinese Communist Party. But if you'll know, I almost without fail refer to it that way because I want to separate that from the Chinese people, that I don't think for a moment are represented by that party, by the authoritarian regime of Xi Jinping. 1.4 billion people, I'm confident 1.2 or 1.3 billion of them would prefer to live in a place that is fundamentally different than the one that Xi Jinping is delivering to them, with zero tolerance for religious freedom inside of their own country. You talked about this, 1 million Muslims being held in what, for all the world, looks like concentration camps from the 1930s. Churches there, even the underground churches that have historically been allowed to exist, now under great pressure, enormous pressure, people being jailed for attending underground church. I mentioned that the second time I traveled that the Pope declined to meet with me. He declined to meet with me because I had called out the failure of the Catholic Church to protect the Catholic faith inside of that place, allowing the Chinese Communist Party to select the bishops that would lead the Catholic Church inside of China. That is deeply dangerous for a church. And make no mistake about it, the Chinese Communist Party, when they attack, when they move around the world, including inside the United States, they do it with propaganda, they do it with espionage, but one of their main tools is to try to undermine the church structures in the nations that they are trying to gain political influence, because if they can eliminate these faith institutions, and they know this, by the way, if they can eliminate these faith institutions, then their capacity to exert their political power will be greatly eased. They will be able to move about the cabin in ways that they can't if the people are backstopped by religious institutions. So yes, they present multiple risks to the world, indeed to Western civilization, and their intent to undermine faith every place that they go is a very real threat to each and every one of us, and certainly to anyone who's a believer.
Zooming back out, the theme of this conference is human rights, democracy, and religious freedom. It's easy to try and fit these into neat philosophical imperatives and assume that each reinforces the other and is a universal good. But on the global stage, advancing each of these while making practical decisions regarding national security, economic growth, geopolitics can be enormously complex, as you know. How do you think the world should strike the right balance, and how do you view this set of issues?
Yeah, so that's why I caveated my remarks today as not academic or theoretical, but practitioners, a practitioner's view of religious freedoms. The truth is, I very seldom saw conflict between those two. There were a handful of times, perhaps, where there were leaders that were behaving badly in terms of religious freedom, but with whom we needed to work for some other reason to protect something that mattered to America. But most often, they actually fell together. They were actually often quite aligned. In that speech that I gave in Cairo, I opened my remarks with a line that my speech writing team hated, absolutely hated. I opened my remarks with a line that said, "I'm Mike Pompeo, I'm an evangelical Christian." The entire audience, or nearly entire audience, would have been Muslim. And I didn't do this wasn't about bragging, this wasn't about wearing my faith on my sleeve. It was, the message that I had hoped to send was that I want you to be of faith as well. And it's interesting because in the years that have followed, there has literally been no line, and I said far too many words as Secretary of State. There's been no line in any speech that I've given that I've received more personal notes thanking me for, mostly from Muslims. It was that they appreciated, not that I was Christian perhaps, but they appreciated that I was disciplined in my faith, as they considered themselves disciplined in theirs. And so I'll often get notes thanking me, saying, that was bold, that was strong. We share the Abrahamic tradition, but different faiths. But thank you for doing that. And I think that goes to your question, which is, it's the rare occasion when religious freedom actually proves problematic for Western civilization's objectives. Indeed, I think they feed each other in a positive way, and handled correctly by diplomats or leaders, they can be incredibly mutually reinforcing and ought to be.
Do we have questions by chance from the audience? Angela? Thank you. If you'll give me one moment.
The question I get first most often is about UFOs. So let's see how we go.
I will not be asking you about the Kennedy assassination, I promise, Mr. Secretary. And I think you touched upon this briefly, but there's a bit of an echo in here. Do you think Vladimir Putin is a war criminal? And if so, would it be possible, do you think, to negotiate some sort of durable peace agreement that would give sovereignty to Ukraine in a way that will last?
So the answer to the first question is yes. I think he has undoubtedly directed war crimes to be committed inside of Ukraine against churches and families and civilians, non-military target. I think definitionally war crimes at large scale. And I spent enough time with him. I spent enough time with him to know that he's just not going to change. We should pray, but I saw no reason to anticipate that he was ever going to change who he was. He truly does believe that Ukraine is part of greater Russia. In the same way that I'm confident Kansas is part of America, right? He believes it. So what does that mean for peace, for how one finds peace? Two things. The only thing that will stop him, and by the way, I don't think he's anywhere prepared for peace today. I don't think we're there. The only way that you stop him is deterrence, right? You have to convince Vladimir Putin that the cost of his aggression exceeds the benefit, right? Basic deterrence 101. And clearly, in February of 2022, we lost that. We collectively, the Western world, lost that. certainly the United States lost its capacity to deter him. So you got to get it back. This means you have to impose real costs on Russian military, on Russian leadership, and convince Putin that the costs are greater than the benefits of continuing that conflict. Once you've done that, then it is, I think, possible to put a security architecture in place that gets you to the imperfect peace that we had for 75 years, right? So we shouldn't forget, right, the issues that took place in Georgia, in the Transcaucasus. This is not, right, Crimea in 2014, or excuse me, 2013. We shouldn't forget this isn't Vladimir Putin's and the Russians' first effort, but the proper security architecture combined with the will of the Western world to put deterrence in place and impose real costs can get you a more stable, more peaceful boundary between Ukraine and Russia.
Something to hope for. The next question is from Marcus, our friend from Oxford. President Reagan worked with the Vatican to battle the Soviet Union and totalitarianism. What lessons can we learn from this in the battle with today's evil empires?
It's a great question. Indeed, I think you could go back a long time in U.S. history, back to the Civil War. You could go back to both World Wars I and II, and you can see the centrality of faith leaders in the world at creating the conditions for there to be civil order, for the conflict to end. You read these great books about President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul II, and the work that the three of them did together. Three great leaders, three amazing leaders that built out the capacity for peace and prosperity. I remember in my time, obviously on a much less epic scale, the Abraham Accords. There were so many faith leaders that were praying for President Trump, for Prime Minister Netanyahu, for the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates, and for the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, praying for them to build out an understanding between these three faiths in this region and have more nations recognize the right of Israel to exist. I think the lessons that the question suggests are quite right, that the combination of civil leaders, governmental leaders, and religious leaders always leads to a higher likelihood of more human dignity and religious freedom and less war and conflict.
And forgive me, I'm struggling with some handwriting. The next comes from Dr. Prodromou, and she would like to ask, would you support inclusion of the ecumenical patriarchate and other religious minority communities from Turkey when it comes time to, well, would you support their inclusion when it comes time to renegotiate the U.S.-Turkey MOU on protection of cultural heritage, which is set to be renewed in 2025?
Yes.
Easy.
And brother, it's just, and the other thing to say is, it's, by the way, it would be normal, actually, to do that. It wouldn't be ahistorical. And so it's not too great a stretch to think that it's possible to achieve with the right leadership, most importantly, probably the right leadership in the United States.
Very much so. Sorry here. Well, I actually want to ask, I think it's the question a lot of people in the room want to know, very serious, maybe the most serious. Tomorrow night is a huge soccer game. Olympiacos is playing. Will you be rooting for them?
Of course. Susan and I have become big football fans, and of course you have to forgive us. I'm Italian, so AC Milan is our team. Oh. So I'll pray and I'll be good.
And we started on a personal note, and I think maybe we should end on that similar note before I give you the floor for closing thoughts. What worries you most for your children and grandchildren's future in this world, and how do you prepare them to confront that which worries you?
So this is a perfect question, perhaps, to close our time together out here. Xi Jinping is problematic. Vladimir Putin's a bad guy. I spent lots of time with the Taliban, not good people. I spent way too much time with Chairman Kim in North Korea, bad guy. the risk that they present to the world pales in comparison to the risk that we don't teach the next generation about America's Judeo-Christian heritage. If we do not inculcate in those who come behind us, if we do not remind them about the importance of religious faith and the capacity for every human being to worship in the way they want, if we teach them in our country, if we teach them that America is a racist nation, or that America is a nation that can survive as a wholly secular institution, then that is frightening to me. Because in the end, we'll push back against these bad actors. We'll get it right. If we lose these foundational ideas for the next generation, no republic has ever gotten it back. And so that's far and away the greatest risk to me, is that in our schools, I think this may be true in other places in the world, but I can speak to it directly in America. If we're teaching our kids crap in schools, it will be an enormous challenge to get another 250 great years. But here's the rub. Here's the rub of that. I would bet on Western civilization all day long. I wouldn't put a penny behind Chinese Communist Party rule, or the rule of Iran, or the communist leadership in Russia, up against the leadership of the decent and good people who are faithful. I wouldn't. And this, and I say that because of a simple reading of his words. He's watching. There's no doubt the Lord is watching, and he sees us when we get it wrong too, including me. We have this responsibility, and the fact that you are gathering this group together tomorrow for the first time is so heartening to Susan and me. Because I'm just like you. I'm out there trying every day to do my part, to take care of my family, to build my little business, and all the things that we do in our lives. And when I see that you all gather around this important idea, this idea of preserving and protecting the Greek Orthodox Church, protecting faith, and an incredibly valuable a faith institution that the world cannot afford to undermine, it reminds me why it is I believe what I said to begin the answer to this question. It reminds me why I am confident that 250 years from now, that's how long America has roughly been around, that 250 years from now, there will be a gathering just like this one, and maybe the 84th Secretary of State or the 86th Secretary of State will be there, and I pray that she or he will have the chance to be with you and thank you and to love you and to be with you in the same way I got the chance to be today. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You were fantastic.
Thank you.